as soon as I see my little red line, start broadcast and play. Clickety-clack, clickety-clack. We are beginning. A couple minutes after the thing, Jackson and I were jibber-jabbering. All of these steampunky stuff, tortuganwordpress.com, the wonderful logo. One of these days we will have sound to go with this, but one thing at a time, gang. And there's the website. You can go to wordpress.com, Troubles in Paradise Project. There's a bunch of book-length stuff there that everyone can draw off of. People can put in questions to me, and people can find links to donate, etc., to keep the project going. So that's our opening blurb as usual. And here we are. Let me get my screen up here so I see who we're dealing with. Jackson Wheat's here today. And say hi, Jackson.
Hi.
As terse as possible.
I'm broadcasting from North Carolina instead of my normal.
Oh, you're in North Carolina instead of Louisiana. It's still just as humid there.
Yeah, all day, every day.
Yeah, it's not humid here, but hot for us. So we're pushing 100 degrees here. We've had some fires in some of the regions, and not nearly as terrible as what's going on in California, where it's like perpetual fire season now. But nevertheless, we like it when it's not in the near triple digits, and we would prefer it to be a little bit less. And I don't have an air-conditioned house, so it's a little bit toasty here. Anyway, as usual, the main theme of the part of the show is the Contested Bones book from Rupe and Sanford that I've been analyzing bit by bit. The Australopithecines is the section that I've been going through here, and they've been just beating a dead horse on the bipedalism issue. And their model is that Australopithecines cannot possibly have been normal bipeds. They must have been just chimpanzee, ape kinds of things. And, oh, I see we got Karis. And Karis of the Svelte Voice. You should follow a link and come on in there. And likewise for anybody else that's got the links in the side chats and that for that. Anyway, that they're really digging a hole on the whole issue of bipedalism. In this one case, I put up some links because remember, I like to have links to full texts. And if not, then it's troublesome. You can't follow up on things and you can't check stuff out. But I found two spots where Rupe decided to cite PhD theses as his documentation, one of which apparently is in French. And had no date to boot. And so there was really no way of feasibly tracking it down. But I happen to have works from both of those scientists in my bibliography, so I put some links up to some of their papers direct so that you can kind of see what they were talking about. One of them was on Australopithecine arches, or whether they had any, and it's fairly clear that they didn't have a well-developed arch like the bent in our foot. And the point is that neither apparently did the tracks at Laetole, because we have a lot of work later on, which in previous episodes I had cited, that went into the fact that recent analyses of that have shown that there's a relatively weak arch structure in this Lucy thing that's uncharacteristic of modern human beings, but perfectly consistent with what we know about Australopithecine feet. So, hello, BJ is in there. Hi, Beej. And hi, Karis.
Hi, Beej. Hi, Karis.
Karis of the Svelte Voice that just is like velvet.
The blue unicorn.
Yeah, the velvet unicorn. Anyway, it's the same old shtick. They're still averaging only about 2 sources per page as the book progresses. There's still a lot of repetition. There's occasional newer material, but it's starting to weight more and more for older stuff. It's still running heavily on authority quoting and secondary citation. Something like 55% of it or so are just secondary sources. And then they're still running at about a third wrong on the technical citations, where they're deliberately stepping past relevant information that goes into things. Anyway, Harcourt-Smith, that I put a couple of his papers up to, a summary piece and another technical paper, is quite explicit about the evolution of hominid bipedality, and that it's still a bit of an open question as to how arboreal they were, but basically the bipedality started fairly early. I'm personally perfectly happy with the idea that Australopithecines were pretty damn good climbers and had enough of an opposable side toe that they could scamper up a tree way better than Homo erectus could, or we can.
Well, that was they did that in the BBC Walking with Beasts episode where
Yeah.
they're escaping the Dinofelis.
Yeah, it's really that it's a thing that isn't really that hotly contested an issue today. And I still got C. Brown, the creationist, who was just beating the dead knuckle walking issue as if it was a standard thing, and he just went on repeating the same bits that apparently there's a little bit of a bone that can be interpreted in the wrist as being consistent with there maybe being a knuckle walker somewhere back earlier in the lineage of primates. And this was an argument that was being put up in the 1980s, and it's not unfeasible. The point is, none of them were saying that Australopithecines were knuckle walkers or that they had that feature. And none of the evidence since then has helped support all of that. So it's just like an idiot dead letter on this. Yes. And, a clade starfish says if kangaroos can become arboreal. Yeah, there's some interesting examples of that. And then there's that one little one in the synapsid line that was apparently a little arboreal bit. There's, if you think about habitats in general, you've got wet if you're underwater, and then you've got dry, and eventually you got like trees and plants that stick up. These are all part of the habitat. And so, you're going to find lots of different critters that are going to play around with the environment. And even in interesting terms, even though we tend not to realize it, if you look at it by species, one of the things that's really fascinating when you realize in nature is that most animals fly. When you account all the insects and the 9,000 species of bats or birds and what 3,000 species of bats and all that, that it turns out, and the extinct pterosaurs and the extinct birds and all the rest, it turns out that flight is a really useful adaptation. It's not easy to get, but once you get it, you get it. And you're able to adapt into all the ability to just go bloop and fly away from your potential predator. Now all you have to worry about is potential flying predators. And then, of course, we all know, if we're familiar with the most fascinating example of code adaptation are bats and moths, that the bat develops echolocation to better track the moth, and the moth develops jamming systems to interfere with the echolocation, and the bat develops countermeasures to overcome that, and then the moth develops ways of dropping in flight so that the mass of the bat can't slow down fast enough. And it's just one thing after another in an arms race of adaptation.
You had the Arctidae moths, if I remember correctly, and so you had the Barbastella bats who had really low amplitude echolocating waves, and so to compensate. Yeah. Good times.
And so there's varying ways that animals compensate for each other. And so this is one of the things that's an important lesson for understanding evolution in general. You try to fill in your map of time that you've got animals that are part of populations, all of which are undergoing individual potential mutations, which can spread through a population by natural means that you can measure, and living populations. And then you've got the fact that there's ecological context of the parasites that maybe or maybe not living in them, the bacterial in their guts that are helping them digest stuff or not, the animals that are attacking them or that they have to evade to run away from, and the animals that attack the other animals, and all the different predator-prey relationships between plants and animals and bacteria. It's a complex interconnected web. And in those little holes and niche developments, you could find all sorts of interesting little ways that animals are going to work out. And the more you look into the details, which anti-evolutionists tend not to do, the more you find the fiddly bits that are turning out to be based on specific mutations, point mutations, regulatory mutations, plasticity. There's quite a lot of that where you find a thing has the variation already there, and it can deploy depending on circumstances. So the leaf shape of a maple leaf, for example, can vary within the same species depending on where you're growing. So it can functionally adapt on the fly to more or less desiccation, greater amounts of sunlight or not, more amount of water within that framework. Now the creationists will say, well, that's not evolution then because it's still the same kind of a leaf. But it's giving you clues as to how the evolutionary process does in fact function, that you can have, in a way, like a storage battery of natural variation that's hidden beneath the surface of the surface morphology. That's why another reason why it was harder for morphologically based, which are just looking at the shapes of or whatever. Phenotype is what it's in the official biz. um, didn't have as much advantage as we do in the genetic and developmental biology era, where you can see what's going on down at the genetic level to do all of that stuff, that you can see more of that hidden variation that can pop up in other areas. Oh, Animal Man, hi. Hi, Animal. Animal. Oh, Animals is just waiting for a monkey or ape-like arboreal dinosaur. Yes, well, as a creationist can easily do that. You find in Twitter discussions in particular, you can kind of detect the really low-level bottom feeders when they'll say that there's no such thing as common descent. There's like nothing between, half plant, half a cow, and you're going, whoa. Oh, the Drepanosaurids were arboreal diapsids. Oh, you damn technical person, you, Jackson.
It was just something I thought, because we were talking about like different arboreal reptiles, and so I was like, oh yeah, the Drepanosaurids with their weird clawed tails.
Yeah. Cirrus, good of you to show up early. I wasn't
Hello,
expecting you
sirs.
to be off work so early.
Well, I'm off work, but I'm in the middle of preparing dinner, and I figured I would go ahead and hop in while I was doing that because,
Yeah.
well,
Unacceptable.
Cirrus and I are going to have a chat after the live feed on the issue of doing an audiobook version of Paralogs of Phileas Fogg, and maybe someday later even Evolution Slam Dunk. And I know personally people who are somewhat dyslexic and reading is a pain, where they've really been saying audiobook would be really nice. And so we're going to kind of bite off that project, and we'll see whether or not that's more than we can chew, or whether we can pull it off and make it really neat.
yeah, hopefully.
So,
I do have all the equipment necessary to build it, and I've been doing research on what Audible requires to get everything set up, and it doesn't seem terribly complex, so it should be doable.
yeah, if it's a matter of just the time consuming of the recording part, I'm open for all of that, easy peasy. And you'll find that I'm pretty easygoing on that. I can do multiple takes and all that. And then once we get the thing, because I'm assuming you can assemble this, and we would be assembling it not in long strings, but effectively just paragraph by paragraph.
Oh, it'll actually be so the way that it has to be submitted to Audible is that it has to be submitted chapter by chapter, and each chapter can only be under 120 minutes long once recorded.
Ooh, oh, that should be not a problem then, because most the longest chapters are about 16 pages or so, and hopefully we'll be able to squeak in if somebody. Oh, your thing is exploding. Anyway, this is not about the audiobook thing. So let's go away and eat your food. We'll catch you later on that after the hangout, and have fun with that. So back to science, man. And Karis, RJ, you still can't spell my name. Sometimes I barely spell my own name, so I apologize.
Even though it's only 2 letters.
Yeah, RJ. Well, yes, I often have problems with particular people that have very similar names. So there's Luther Sunderland, and then there's John Sutherland. One of them is an evolutionist, one of them is a creationist, and I'll often confuse which one is which, and I often have to look up whether it's Inhofe or Imhofe, the stupid global warming hating senator. And so I have a slightly dyslexic quality on how I'll confuse terms that way, and that's why I have to remember to look them up to make sure that I haven't goofed and referred to somebody the wrong way, or confused somebody's spelling and all that kind of stuff, because it happens. Everybody does that. Go for is going to make it in the lower third as well. Oh yeah. Now Peter, be a good vertebrate. Don't disturb Karis on that. Anyway, back to the matter at hand then, which was the whole notion about adaptive processes and Australopithecines and hominids and bats and moths and all the rest. There are common threads. I think you would agree with me on this one, Jackson. There are common threads to the dynamics of evolution. That's why studying the living animals is so illuminating, because when you then think about what's going on at a little micro level between this organism and that organism, I do tend to agree with you on this, yeah. Well, hopefully we agree, because we are both trying to make sure the science is right. So if you got the data correct, then duh, it's like you're not going to have an argument between mathematicians on 1 + 1 = 2. You're not going to have any fistfights that go, no, it's just a philosophical position. We have our 1 + 1 = 3ers over here in the other room ready to bring up pitchforks.
That's the postmodern position.
Yes, the postmodernist, yeah, pi is just a social construct,
There you go.
Yeah, I don't go with that. I'm a bit of a closet Platonist in the sense that the fact that the universe seems to be structured so relentlessly with mathematics undergirding relationships, that my working hypothesis is the universe is what mathematics does for a living. And that's kind of neat to realize that that everything in mathematics applies to something in the universe, and everything in the universe ultimately is mathematics. And this is something which is independent of whether gods exist or not, or whether the universe is purely material. It's that, why is it structured mathematically? Why does gravity work the way it does? Why does force equal mass times acceleration? Why is the relationship to that at all? That those relationships are telling us about deeper structure, and that brings you into the kind of semi-Platonism of somebody like Einstein and a lot of the physicists who hold to the notion that whatever deep science you discover mathematically, it's going to be beautiful. It will have a kind of elegant simplicity, even if the formula can be fairly complicated in terms of a lot of variables put in. Underlying it is a wondrous elegance and beauty about it, the way it falls into place in relation to other things. This, although he was taking a religious spin on it, Euler's famous formula, e to the pi I power plus 1 = 0. I learned about that back in college there, where e is the basis of natural logarithms, I is the square root of -1, which don't for a moment think imaginary numbers aren't real. That they actually apply. Electrical engineering makes use of square root of -1 all the time. And then pi, of course, the relationship of the diameter to a circle. And 1 and 0 are the multiplicative and additive identities. And that they should be related at all is kind of neat. Why is that? Can they not be related? We don't know that. But nevertheless, independent of our opinion of it, e to the pi I power plus 1 = 0. Live with it and make do with it. And the same thing goes with nonlinear systems and transfinite numbers and all the rest, where you have to realize that the control freak mentality, that if you can understand, oh, hello, Cap. Welcome to the parade.
Yeah,
Are you going to stay awake today?
I should. I just woke up. I've just been fighting a bunch of allergy crap.
Oh, well, if you just woke up, then you can go back to sleep easily.
Yeah, yeah. I've just, yeah. The nice thing about what I'm allergic to, literally, because it grows wild, literally about maybe 200 yards from my house, and then across the highway
is our lab rat on allergies and how vertebrate biological systems can react to plants in deleterious and inconvenient ways. Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah. Yeah. So I've just.
Oh yeah, Brian brings up the issue, and this is a knockdown, drag out, deep philosophical divide. We built the correlation between math and physics, that there is an intractable divide between the ones that say mathematics is purely an invention of human beings. It's not real other than that. And then the other ones, and I lean towards the other camp, that mathematics has kind of a reality whether we like it or not. And the relationship between physics and mathematics is not just a casual one. So this puts me on one side of the knockdown, drag out fight, but it's ultimately a philosophical one that eventually gets so rarefied that basically you're saying, well, no. You'll find physicists and mathematicians getting into metaphorical fistfights over this to this day, and don't expect them to stop because it's not resolvable. It's an undecidable proposition. We can't get outside of the universe enough, and there are enough undecidable propositions in mathematics. Gödel, the guy with the umlaut, don't forget your Gödel, which is not something that goes around to keep your midriff in. I would recommend those who haven't seen Gödel Escherbach, and I will put, it doesn't have the umlaut because I don't have one on that, but Gödel Escherbach, The Eternal Golden Braid by another guy who I've just suddenly forgot the name of. But anyway, it's a classic book written, I think, in the early 1980s, and it probably is available in your library, and it's really big and thick, and you can literally read it in any order you want because it was constructed to be nonlinear, but you can start at the stop, just like any other book. And it's a tough go because he's talking about mathematics and DNA and Bach, the composer, and Escher, the guys that wrote the thing where people are walking up and down. Oh, you've never heard of the author of Gödel, Escher, Bach? Oh God, what the hell's his name? If I had my bibliography open, I could look at it. But anyway, it's a book that will make your brain go because it is so gobsmackingly inventive and disturbing and thought-provoking as to, is an ant colony conscious? Like a computer could be theoretically conscious, even though the individual ants are like little circuits, diagrams. And why is it that we use DNA? Is there an inevitability to that? What are recursive systems, non-linear? This was really just around the time that Mandelbrot, if you're familiar with him, was putting that nonlinear element back into the front burner and realizing, excuse me, but climate is a nonlinear system. Weather, you have limits on how much you can predict in a nonlinear system because it's nonlinear. And it has, yes, the golden braid, the eternal golden braid, which, by the way, the subtitle of that book is acronyms of G.E. Bach, G.E.B., eternal golden braid has the same letters in reverse, and it's got this neat, Escher has the guys that are walking up and down an eternal staircase. He makes use of optical illusions and all of that. And it's a metaphor for what goes on in recursive systems. And it relates to how life might have developed and how any nonlinear system is just the bugbear of people who are control freaks. And in an economic context, it's one of the reasons why state control socialism is a stupid idea, because it assumes that you can control a nonlinear system, and economic systems are nonlinear. So the very act of I'll say this on the easiest way to grasp a nonlinear system is to compare it to a linear system. Your car is linear. You put your foot down on the gas pedal and it goes faster. You put your foot on the brake and it slows. And you turn the knob on the air conditioner and the temperature goes up or down. And you turn the radio, if you still have knobs on your thing, your MP3 interface or your satellite XEM, doesn't matter. Anyway, but things have discrete functions. But a nonlinear system doesn't follow that. So what if you got in your car and you started putting your foot down on the gas pedal and the radio went up? And you try to adjust the radio and it makes the windshield wiper start. And adjusting the windshield wiper alters the function of the brake. And altering the function of the brake changes the way the air conditioner works. And changing one alters everything else, but not necessarily in the same way each time. Try to make sense out of driving your car that way. And yet, every piece of a nonlinear system is still mechanistic. It's just ungraspable because you can't step outside of the nonlinear system to see the simple connections anymore.
Yeah.
Is your brain fried yet, Cap?
No, I was just gonna say, is it wrong that I think that would be kind of a fun car to drive, not knowing what would come out next?
Well, or bad on your insurance.
Yeah.
But the thing is
unless
that
you're in like the salt flats of Nevada.
Yeah, try it out on there. But it's a useful analogy because there's a difference between the control freak mind that thinks all, and scientism and scientific reductionism. You find aspects of this circulating around the periphery of Richard Dawkins and a lot of things, not necessarily crystallizing in them, but with people who argue about it. Is
We
the
are
whole
just
idea.
atoms.
Yeah, we're just atoms. We're just chemistry. We're just this or that. But nonlinear systems can be more than the sum of their parts. And the parts can be such that even when you understand them, they don't allow you to step up and understand how they integrate. So the idea of emergent properties, Stephen Kaufman particularly goes into that element. And there's issues about artificial intelligence that connect up to that. And the non-artificial intelligence is our own self-awareness, an emergent property of the interaction of a series of nonlinear systems in our brain. That's the little working question that I have lurking around in there. So anyway, I strongly recommend if you want to fry your brain and or be enormously inspired, that if you like mathematics and or evolutionary theory and or music, you can start playing around with Gödel, Escher, Bach. The idea that music and the arts are relevant to this discussion is also really important. A book that I mention every once in a while, which is C.P. Snow's The Two Cultures in a Second Look. Have either you, Jackson or Cap, ever heard of that?
No.
Heard of it?
Aha!
Not read it.
Bad dogs. Okay.
Ah,
C.P.
Bow
Snow,
wow.
Two Cultures in a Second Look. This was done way back in, I think, the early 1960s, and it was a hot ticket item there, and frankly should be again because the problem hasn't gone away,
well,
which is it a good idea for people in the humanities to be scientifically illiterate and or for people in the science department to know diddly squat about the humanities?
Oh, I've heard you talk about this book before.
Yeah. And I was a... Yeah,
Yes.
go ahead, Jackson.
You know, RJ, the problem is I don't read books older than me. So, no, I'm just
Oh,
kidding.
I don't sure, and I bump into a lot of people who don't see movies older than they are either. So that can get you into trouble.
The movies RJ's age are pretty good. There's some good ones out there.
We better
Anyway,
tread carefully. We're on dangerous
the point
ground.
of Snow was a physicist, I think, by training, but he also was very much cultured, and so he would say that somebody who doesn't know who Shakespeare or Bach were, or Einstein and Newton, are equally culturally illiterate. That you should be able to know about all of them, and that knowing about all of them improves your understanding of both. That you and this was an area that I think hit home a little more with me, because in the readings that I have growing up when I was just hitting college, is that I discovered that the early 19th century artists in the Romantic Revolution were really big science groupies. I mean,
Oh,
really
absolutely.
big.
Yeah,
They
definitely.
kept a tight look on the upcoming science of the early 19th century, and they were not disconnected from it. The idea that your literary people would be removed from all of that sciencey stuff, they didn't know about the revolutions that were happening. Look at the set that Mary Shelley and Frankenstein, that bunch. There's your drug-addled artist groupies, but they were also interested in the latest science that was going on, and the place everything was in ferment. So you find this really all the way through into the 1830s and 1840s, and it isn't really until well into the 20th century that you start seeing the formulation of much more rigorous science disciplines, whether you take the science courses and you don't bother about the arts, or you're in the artistic world and you're not really worried about all that sciencey stuff.
Well, even in college, they are making us take humanities courses as well as science courses. And I'm, of course, a biology major, and so I still have to take classes like English and history.
Yeah.
And stuff like that.
And the fact that it's have to take is still an indication of the thing that it's not coming naturally to people, that we still have a culture that tends to split them in half. And it gets as well into the history department element. I can't understand the sciences without knowing the history of it. I can't understand the art without knowing the history of it.
Yeah.
If I'm looking back, all of those CDs behind me back in the ancient days when I could afford to buy music and stuff, I had money to throw around for that. So that's the reason why I can build off of my foundation of stuff. But all of those composers are listed chronologically, not alphabetically. So I don't put Bach next to Beethoven next to Bartók. No, Bach is a Baroque composer. Bartók's a modernist. Beethoven is an early Romantic. And I'm filing them chronologically, and that gives a very different perspective. You can see how the music is changing, how innovations are appearing in a way that if you just looked at them alphabetically.
RJ?
Yeah.
Are you saying music evolves?
Oh, it does indeed. In fact, in one of the little snippets, I think it was in the chapter 1 of the old tip book, I called attention to not only music but tarot cards and playing card history as examples of how human institutions evolve and how you can use them. That's the counterpart of how you can date things stratigraphically in the geologic column, because there are patterns to things independent of how they came about. That if a musicologist uncovered a new Haydn symphony, and there are a couple missing Haydn symphonies, a couple missing Mozart symphonies, and they've got harmonies in there that are really 20th century dissonant, you might wonder whether or not that's okay, that there's something suspicious about it. In the same way that when I saw the stylish but clumsy League of Extraordinary Gentlemen and Captain Nemo's Art Deco car that he had.
I do enjoy that movie. I'm sorry.
It's got some good moments in it. I didn't detest it the way I was expecting to, given the bad reviews, and it was a colossal failure at the box office and had problems with it. But there were bits and pieces of it that really were quite well done.
Yeah,
and,
I think so.
It needed an editor and some tightening. But you remember that Nemo's car was this 6-wheel Art Deco thing.
Yeah.
Reeks of 1930s style. Nothing like that existed in 1910. Nobody designed anything that looked like that in 1910. That's a 1930s design. And so there's things. Yeah, well, it's beyond ahead of their time, that there are certain kinds of things that there are times, however, that can surprise you, where Brahms's piano quintet, for those of you who are into classical music, there's a version of it that Arnold Schoenberg orchestrated in the 1930s. He was a big Brahms nut and went through, he's normally known for extremely astringent modernist music, but he was also a great admirer of Brahms and Bach and all the rest. And so he did an orchestrated version of it. And the first time I ever heard that music was the orchestrated version. And it was just throwing me off, because I'm hearing this stuff and it says, God, that sounds like Brahms. But it's got xylophones and things in it. That's not the orchestration that Brahms would do. And only later on, when I found out that it was actually a 1939 thing, that the date of the making of it, even though note for note, it was exactly right. And that the surprise was that there's a harmony in there that reeked of Richard Strauss. And I couldn't believe it was in the original Brahms, but it was. And Brahms was flirting with certain harmonies back in 1850 when the original quartet was written that are remarkably advanced for their period. And it's a fair and square thing. But the orchestration with all the xylophones and stuff, that was pure Schoenberg. We're at halfway point here, so let me put up my shameless plug. And not that it does much good, but nevertheless, it is our obligation and desire and pleasure to call attention to our patrons, which we got another one down the line. So we've got Stephen and Mary Gale and Dyer and Andrew and Eat and Yui and Mona and Hendril and Jen and Jody and Daniel and Ralph and Eric and Benjamin and Steigles and Alex and Suris and Totus Rial, Suris, who was just in the room, and Everett and Paul. Thank you all. And even though Patreon is slow as molasses for trickling money out to me, nonetheless, from your standpoint, you are still supporters of the project, and I am most delighted at your doing so. I've also got a much faster way to help for real, which is the GoFundMe.com DCGo thing. I still have this vision and dream of like 100 or more people who are like committed to like $5 a month, $60 a year thing for permanent steady. That would make a big difference in finances and make it so that I would be able to go, hey, I'm out of ink. I need to buy ink. I'll just go and get ink, rather than have to figure out, oh, can I do that? No, never mind. So there's the stop sharing thing. There's my pathetic moaning about finances, as real as it is, nonetheless. That's
if
what
I were
the
to
facts
throw
are.
if I were to throw something out there, I randomly hopped back in because I've got a little time.
Oh, yeah.
If I were to throw something out there, my groceries are completely paid for by Patreon. Like, that's how we eat. And I
Wow.
still...
How the hell do you get your things as quickly? Because I don't get much actual money from Patreon at all.
Well, I only get like a little under $100 from Patreon, which is enough for me and Pam to eat for 2 weeks.
Oh, I know. Yeah, that's a huge chunk of money.
It's
at the moment,
it's enough to, like right now, it's enough to support groceries for about
I'm on food assistance here, and that's also allowed me to have a free telephone. So that has helped quite a bit.
The point I was trying to make with that, though, is that as somebody who also uses Patreon in order to support himself, to actually be able to do content and everything else, I also support RJ on Patreon. So, like, practice what you preach.
Indeed, and it is enormously the symbolism of it, even beyond how much money trickles into my thing, is important. That it knows that I'm not alone, and that there are people out there that recognize what it is I'm doing. I would just like to see more. I'd love to get up. It frustrates me to see how well flat earthers and creationists do. That they have a support network that floods by comparison money to them, and I'm going, oh, if only I had no ethics and could just bullshit so easily. But rats, I can't quite pull that little trick off there. Anyway, there was my shameless plug. The other part of the show is references to things that I encounter along the way. I'd found this wonderful little tweet a couple weeks ago, actually closer to a month ago, from you, Ross, on the GABA neuron things. Ross does what I call gee whiz a lot, and other creationists and intelligent designers do the same thing, which is to point to some new technical paper that has something that's like complicated, and they hint that it's designy. And the point is that there's probably an evolutionary history of every one of those things, and so I'll call attention to it. Well, GABA neurons are another one that there's evolutionary history on. There's quite a lot of work that's been done about how those originate in animals and how our particular vertebrate and mammal primate version has developed and evolved, and the genes involved. And so I put a couple technical papers up that were relevant to that, and particularly then I had a bit that there was a paper that was done by the Intelligent Design Gang that I put a link to. And it's important for those, if you want to look through those, you'll find that none of those technical papers are referenced by them, even though they're waxing poetic about the GABA neurons. And all of them were earlier papers. So you wonder, how did they manage to miss? How did 3 researchers in the field, each with genetic creds, manage to miss relevant work that relates to the evolutionary side of the subject that they want to imply doesn't have one?
So RJ, are you saying that they aren't honest?
I'm saying they're tortukans. The honesty part doesn't have to enter into it. It's that they have an argument that they want to make. They have a preconceived desire, and they only look around for pieces that fit.
It's like what that's what we were talking about in the book they were writing before the stream, is how White and the other creationists are just absolutely failing in every turn to incorporate data into their models.
Yeah, well, White in particular, I reinforce it. For those of you who've been living in a cave, Jackson and I are doing a book on the Answers in Genesis Answers books, and we're going to be filleting quite a few of them, including the current edition of their Answers Book 2, which is, or is it Answers Book 1? I can't remember which number it's got.
Well, it's all, it's 1 through 4, all of them.
Yeah, you've got more of them than I do. Anyway, no one's really done a full court press source analysis of this, so it's about time. And we've got between us quite a substantial array of knowledge, so we're pulling it apart. But this Monty White fellow, who's kind of an old hand, he's an older creationist, and I think this is almost like, here, let Monty do this chapter, he will enjoy it. And he writes this thing out that has no sources at all. It's just a repetition of desire and some really hilarious charts in there.
It's interesting because while he doesn't cite anything, you're able to pick it apart and figure out what he is relying on, which is the fun part.
Isn't that? Oh, that's the funnest thing. I did that in Slam Dunk, where I was able to isolate where people are getting their material from when they don't tell you where they're getting it from, because some little blipdoids are so specifically wrong that the odds of 2 people independently coming up with the same dumb is remote.
It's not very parsimonious.
Yeah. And so some of these things can be terribly diagnostic. That's why I've given lessons about how, when you're doing Google searchings of things, learn how to Google search fragments of stuff, particular way that they word the citation. You don't even have to put in the whole quote. You're looking at a segment that's very specifically worded or has an ellipsis at a particular point. And if you can track that and pull up that particular version, you can start finding out what quote mine they may have
Oh
used.
yeah, that's oh well, I probably shouldn't say too much because it'll be showing up in my next Matt Powell video. But we had a field day with that one. But
Yeah.
you'll all get to see it shortly, I guess. So,
Yeah, I'm still hoping at some point we can have an interaction with dear Matt Powell. There's so many questions I want to ask him about his reliance on Kent Hovind.
oh yes, funny you should ask that. It's some I guess we'll talk about afterwards. Yes.
Yeah.
What's funny is that he has a fixation with Kent Hovind. Yet, from what I gather, he learned a lot of his young Earth he learned a lot of his shtick from Steven Anderson, and Anderson hates Hovind.
Oh,
Yeah.
well, many do. Hovind is bottom feeder and has his own little particular niche. But Matt is a smorgasborder by nature. He's one of these that just kind of cherry picks little bits and little bits and little bits. And you must admit, very few people on Earth are as confident of their position as Kent Hovind is. So you naturally want to feel, wow, anybody that's that sure of himself must be right.
This is why we call this is why con and con man is a shorthand for confidence.
Yeah. Oh, Brian Stevens pointed out his favorite Escher print is Waterfalls because water seeks its level. I really do recommend everybody take a whack at Gödel, Escher, Bach. Unless you got a ton of money floating around, you probably don't want to buy the damn thing because it's kind of pricey still because it's a big book. But if your library doesn't have it, fie upon them. They ought to, because it is one of the classics of the analytical field. And he's done other works in that beyond that. But Gödel, Escher, Bach is a mind bender. It will open up your thoughts to all sorts of things you hadn't thought about before. And even if it doesn't resolve stuff, for a book that's 30 years old, that it's still pregnant with utility, even though we're now in an era way more advanced in genetic engineering and physics and evolutionary knowledge and all of that. The issues that he raises are so fundamental and intricate and come up in, if you're going to deal with presuppositional creationism and a lot of stuff about why the universe is mathematical and all of that, you come up with that with Callum arguments and that all the time. Gödel, Escher, Bach is a good running field for you to get used to a lot of the issues involved. So it's that and C.P. Snow's Tooth Cultures in a Second Look. I think there's a revised edition of it that came out more recently in the 70s or 80s because the issues are still important. That and plus, the more ammo you have in your quiver, the more you know about interconnected stuff. The more you know about the history and the art and the science collectively, and you can use one to talk to the other. So you can bring somebody in on a thing you didn't know anything about, in the same way that if you discover that you know about car mechanics or that you know about football history or anything, that you can now link it up with other stuff in ways that only improves the argument, in my view. So anyway, GABA neurons. So those little papers in there I think will be very useful. There's a lot of good summaries about the dynamics of them. They're part of the. What's interesting about our brains is how little new there is. That it's a lot of it very, very ancient biological systems and receptor systems, that the overall neuron layout, including pyramid neurons and all that, is pretty much set by the time you get into the primates. And of course, we expand the segments where we've got sections that are heavily devoted to the social system brain that we have. And that's something that was happening with the primates. So there's a monstrously large neuroscience literature out there, which anti-evolutionists almost completely ignore. And so that's another area where the more you read up on any of those topics, you're going to be farther ahead than the opposition on that. And it will be always useful. I've given a general lesson that nobody will be interested in everything, but everybody is interested in something. So what you want to pick is a field that you really adore and that nobody has to put a prod for you to study, and dive into more of the primary source literature on that. You're at a bit of a disadvantage if you're interested in religion and history, because a lot of the scholarly literature isn't necessarily available online. Ironically, science geeks have a better row of this. Every once in a while, when I'm trying to hunt up some of these issues about translations of ancient texts or What was the relationship of what theologians thought about flat Earth? That it's tough to find scholarly material that's available online about it. A lot of it is stuff that's really in more rarefied journals or in scholarly books that then you have to track down in the libraries and all that kind of stuff. So it's a little bit tougher to deal with. But in the sciences now, and geology, astrophysics, any of these other areas, that mammoth amounts of the primary source literature is directly accessible. And you'll be able to hunt that stuff up and download it freebie, PDFs either through ResearchGate or the journals themselves. Biological stuff most accessible because it's often funded by big companies. What about mastodon amounts? Oh, Jackson, yes, come in and talk about our little mastodons. It was interesting. I learned an awful lot about a lot of the little fiddly bit details of that in working on this new book, because mastodons and mammoths, I hadn't realized in my own map of time that mammoths are the earliest group of elephants to be diverging, and that the elephants are way down the line.
Backwards.
And then the mastodons are relatively recent players on
RJ, that's backwards.
Oh, reverse?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, mastodons first and then the mastodons. See, always they start with M. It confuses me.
Yeah, that's
when I was a kid, they were just you had the woolly mammoth and you had a mastodon, and like, duh, aren't they like the same, and they're extinct, so they would have to be in the same lump. In the same thing happened with dinosaurs, where if you look at the works that were being done in the 80s, they were still uncertain about what those carnosaurs were. And they knew that there were tyrannosaurs and allosaurids, and then there were the dilophosaurids that were occurring in the Triassic. And were they closely related or not? As it turns out, no. There are actually three very divergent lineages. And by the time in the 1990s, when Paul Sereno and that bunch start doing their little cladistic analysis, things start clarifying. So now, if you look at a modern dinosaur book, they recognize that the tyrannosaurs are actually jumbo versions of saurosaurs. Allosaurids are very different groups that were once the dominant predator lines back in the Jurassic. And then the dilophosaurids were kind of a little also-ran bunch that sort of fizzled out after the Triassic. Oh, frustrated atheist, I missed the Australopithecine talk, didn't you? Yeah, that was in the first half hour. I will summarize briefly that the creationist position on Australopithecines is that they are just chimpanzee-like quadrupedal tree climbers, not at all human-y. And of course, since everything is all happening at once, because they're young Earth creationists, that the Laetoli footprints are actually done by people who were strolling around in South Africa for reasons unknown at a moment. Was this after the flood, before the flood? There's kind of leery about when the chronology is on that. They're kind of dicey. And to do that, cherry picking is necessary. They've got to be very careful how they parse their way through the taxa, because the problem is that everything seems to be a transitional sequence. As you develop very early bipedal primates that gradually develop into the obligatory bipeds that can still climb a bit of trees, like the Australopithecines, that still have relatively small brains, but then they are spreading around in Africa, and then eventually spawn off our genus Homo, which have just the earliest fragments of tools, and then after that, Homo erectus, that spreads all the way into Eurasia, and then branches off in various ways into the Neanderthals, and then groups that eventually lead off into Homo sapiens, which also then spread out in pulses. That's a lot of data field to look at. And to try to pigeonhole it not only into just simple little boxes where the apes are on one side and human beings are on the other, and only us. And then the young Earth creationist necessity that they got to scrunch it all together into a short time frame. It's a mess. And so it's a matter of trying to see what chronology isn't presented and what model on their side isn't worked out. Like, in practice, any fossil that they see either is or is not during the flood. Either it's before the flood and occurring as the flood occurs, or it's somehow or other after the flood. And they don't really have a clear conception of that. And then, of course, what is happening with all these human beings running around, breeding like rabbits, to repopulate the planet, and then to manage to get to Mesoamerica in time to build Tenochtitlan. It's not an easy little thing to work out in their head, and they don't. So Here we are, 5:51. Do we want to have some comments from our gallery about summaries or questions? I don't think I missed any questions in the live chat. But if there were so, and of course, Cap was ready to go to sleep.
RJ,
Yeah.
if there were mammoth amounts and mastodon amounts, the real question is, were there Dinothera amounts? I
Yes,
think
yes,
it's really interesting because the part of the study on the placement of mastodons and elephant phylogeny is just weird and very difficult to parse out, evidently. And so they were trying to figure the elephantids out by using their hyoid bone, which is a bone in the neck. It's kind of horseshoe shaped.
Yeah.
But then paleogenomics kind of came along and solidified the relationships that were already starting to be built among elephantids by the
Yeah.
hyoid bone. And so just
Yeah.
more little data blips for creationists to ignore.
Yeah, and this is the thing that's so fascinating in any area that you start looking into it, is you've got a way bigger connective link going on in the regular sciences than anything the poor creationist is used to. The creationist doesn't realize how much information they need to accommodate, and they don't realize how much information has come along in addition to what they weren't accommodating before. So a lot of the attitudes that you get at Answers in Genesis, even the technically minded ones, are basically running on slightly steroidal versions of arguments that were being tossed off in the 1930s or even back in the 19th century by anti-evolutionists. It's just behind the curve, even on the regular biology. But now that we're in the developmental biology area and the genetic area where we know more and more and more about it, oh, dearie me, every blip of that information needs to be covered. So that's why I want to popularize that source methods approach, where every individual defender of science has some areas that they know the general picture and they have a good working map of time. Everybody needs to have a good working map of time in their heads. You need to have a sense of how old the universe is, how old the earth is, how old dinosaurs are, all of this stuff, even if you don't necessarily know all the little fiddly bits. And then have areas that you really are fascinated in, whether it's the geology, whether it's the astrophysics, whether it's particular forms of animals, living or fossil, and get enough well versed in it that you are familiar with primary source data block, and be aware of what anti-evolutionists have or have not said about that. I think people who have been following me online will notice that the questions that they run away from like the plague are those, where did you get this information from and how did you check it? And when they say, well, no, we've done work on this, and I can say, no, you haven't, because I've read the material and I know exactly what has and has not been done on the specific case of the reptile mammal transition. And by the time we're done, Jackson and I are going to have about the same grip on the data field on a whole slew of topics, because between the two of us, we're really pinning down their source base of what gets left out and not. And there's always wonderful to have a factoid of information like the probanognaathids with the reptile mammal transition, where you literally know what's been said about them by everybody in the anti-evolution field, to where you can be smug as all get out saying, how would you find out about that unless you had read outside your little box? So that's part of the game that's going on. Oh, Heat Shield says, I don't know what an Australopithecine is. I just respect this man and try to hear everything you have to say. Australopithecines are the group of hominids, hominid being, Les Jackson, would you like to give a brief summary of the Australopithecines? Because you know a lot of the systematics terms even better than I do.
He wants a description of the Australopithecines.
Yeah, where they fit in on things, the chronology of it, kind of like if you needed to put the little bumper sticker flashcard version of Australopithecines for somebody who has no idea what you just said. That's what we want.
So you get so within the hominins, which are all the apes more closely related to humans than to chimps, which is the general recent usage of that term, you get a set of facultative bipeds, and from about 6 million years ago or so, to 4.5 million years ago, and about 4.5 million years ago, you get the first Australopithecines like A. anamensis and Garhi and Boise and these other guys.
The A being
So-
Australopithecine, which is the genus
Yeah.
that applies to the specific species name. Sorry for the
Yes.
interjection.
Oh, no, perfectly good. And so you see this very slow, gradual accumulation of more and more humanoid traits as time goes on with this. You see the pelvis becoming more like ours and less like earlier apes. You see the changes in the spine and the legs and things like that, and especially in the teeth, because teeth are very important to
Yeah.
in mammal
They give
studies.
instant clues to diet and habitat.
Yep. And so the Australopithecines kind of break off into two lineages. You get the robust Australopithecines called Paranthropus, which was this little group that just kind of died out after a little while. And then one lineage eventually gave rise to us, or to the Homo species. So, did I do good?
Yeah, I think that sums it up there, and including the chronology. And that's all part of the things that we would get in on the map of time issue. When you're always fascinated when you deal with anybody on either side of this case, that if they don't know as much as they think they do, that can lead them astray. And whenever we want to have our game upped to where when we interact with any anti-evolutionist, we're up on the data field. We know what the facts are. We know the terminology. We're not thrown off by things. We know the limits of what we know and what we don't. We're kind of up on the cutting edge literature so we can deal with material. And geeks like us who are going after creationism directly, we want to have read, frankly, as much or more anti-evolution stuff than the anti-evolutionist has. So we know their arguments. We know what things they bring up. We know what tropes they
Cap
like.
is snoring.
Hmm?
I think Cap is snoring.
Cap is probably, I mean, yes, we may
No.
have to, yes. No,
Oh,
you
wait.
are, you poor
You
little
okay,
kid.
Cap? You need some help?
No. What it is I'm leaning up against someone and I went to stretch and bumped my headset mic, so it made the noise.
My,
A likely
the
story.
troubles that we have in the 21st century.
Yeah.
Heat Shield asks, does the speaker guest have books or anything? Thank you so much for this guy. Me speaker? Oh gosh, I do. I have a link to Evolution Slam Dunk that's in the video description. You can find it right in there. Click, please buy. RJ needs royalties. It's the book on the reptile-mammal transition, and I'm not exaggerating that nobody had ever done a full court press analysis of the reptile-mammal transition as to how anti-evolutionists covered it. There were all sorts of books by paleontologists on the reptile-mammal transition for other mammal paleontologists. There was a bunch of those, but not ones that really addressed what the facts were up to date and how anti-evolutionists did or did not address them. So I went through and did the whole shebang. And so that means that when you get that work, you get caught up. Admittedly, it's too dry for poor Cap, but nonetheless, it is meticulously accurate.
It has some interesting parts. It reads like a textbook at times.
Yeah,
I
Well,
disagree with that wholeheartedly. I disagree wholeheartedly. I've had the misfortune to have to read many chapters into text.
Oh, Heat Shield didn't mean me, he meant the other dude. Well, Jackson of Cirrus, I don't think has a book out. That is not his gig. But Jackson and I are writing a book together.
I'm also working on my own current, we're editing, or I'm editing currently, and then RJ and I are co-authoring one.
Yeah, so we have some things that are in the wakes. That Jackson has his own general summary of evolution that he's been working on. I've seen the draft copy of it, and then we're going full press on the Answers book. So it's all Jackson has a YouTube channel. Jackson, you've got a wrench. You should be able to go in and dump things into the live field over there and give them the skivvy on your channel. Anyway,
Okay.
So we're at 6 o'clock. It's hot as Hades here. It's humid as hell where all you guys are. So we'll probably pull this up on the shorty here. And the upshot is to get more and more people on the source methods bandwagon It's the no-lose approach to things where you want to learn everything you can. You want to make accessibility, get used to, you can use the internet in so many powerful ways, but don't focus just on secondary sources. That when you can get the primary sources, that's really useful. You can use it as a measuring stick for your own knowledge too. Because if you're looking at evolution matters and you find a technical paper that is one that it turns out, boy, you've seen anti-evolutionists talking about it and evolutionists talking about it, and so it's like a taffy pull over this particular work, and you download it and it's like it's written in Martian, then that's a clue that you need to get up to speed on what the terminologies are and what the contexts are. Meanwhile, if you looked at the same paper and you go, I understand what they're saying, I know the issues involved, I can follow their terminology, then you are up to speed. And that means that you can dispense with the secondary account and go with the primary source ammunition. So all of this is a way of getting more and more people up to speed on more and more things. Oh, clade starfish, chilly 7C, 7 centigrade, which is not as cold as it sounds, as opposed 7 Fahrenheit is another matter.
Yeah.
But
I actually have to kind of laugh at that about the whole primary source thing. I got into it with someone on Facebook a while back, where they were quoting all this anti-evolution stuff. I'm like, yeah, please cite your source, because they cited a paper. And I Googled for that, and it took a little bit of digging, but I found an actual full access copy. Most were behind a paywall. I did manage to find one. And I'm like, everything you said is from the abstract. Now here, let me present you the full paper and why that doesn't work.
Yeah.
I've also had a similar experience where I've had two similar experiences where one person I grew up with, who's a young Earth creationist, was arguing about the efficacy of the flood. And I pointed out, are you talking about the Younger Dryas event? And he said, no, I'm talking about the real global flood. I'm like, okay, well, those two are almost the same thing. So please cite your source and I'll give you mine. So he went through and went, okay, here's mine. And as soon as I saw Ken Ham on the front page, I just started laughing and said, you know what? Nope, we're done. My second issue with this was later on when I had a similar argument about the flood with a completely different person. And I said, okay, can you please give me the source for your land bridge argument you're using for how the marsupials got to Australia after the flood? And he said, sure, I can do that. And he immediately linked me to the Watchtower Society.
Yeah. And so you'll find that Tortukans have a natural aptitude for not knowing the difference between a primary and a secondary source.
Yeah.
And once you understand that, you won't be able to change their mind on it. They'll literally never realize that they're dealing with secondary source redaction when they think, oh, this is a primary source because it's got a name and it's got footnotes and all that. That's a primary source. No, it didn't. That there are a difference between the two. The other thing that Cap spotted is an important matter, that although in science papers the abstract is a perfectly fine summary of the main points of the article, an awful lot is there beyond that. And many cases, particularly when you have tendentious pseudoscientists, that they're citing a work that it sounds kind of okay from the abstract, but when you look at the details, you discover, no, the details actually aren't supporting their position. That's what I've been documenting over and over again with Rupe and Sanford, is that, that the little snippets that they glean from the work are misrepresenting the content and stepping around other content that they never even mentioned, like the fact that the very people that are arguing that Australopithecines were somewhat arboreal, Sussman in particular, they weren't claiming they weren't bipeds. That very, very different argument on that. And that was in their own sources. Well, you'd only find that out if you read the original material. Go beyond the abstract. And there are ways around most of that. I know just publicly accessible, you can get 70 to 80% of the technical literature. There are other surreptitious ways of finding between professors and others that you can glom onto where you can find other rarer papers. And then there's, of course, that you bump up with things that not everything's archived. So there may be instances of where there are some things you run into a brick wall because you're looking at the Journal of Human Anthropology and it's a 1967 article and they didn't start archiving it until 1980. So you can't see the original text. You'll just have to go, move around that. But for what you can find, you want to find the primary source as often as possible. And then the other thing that's at the highest level of analysis is don't fret the fiddly bits. is you want to look at their core argument, their main points that they're trying to make, and their core defense points, to where they go, actually, their argument depends on this particular point at issue and or this particular paper. Then you can home in on that. And if you can get there, then you're saving a lot of time, because you don't have to worry about whether they had typographical errors and a lot of other stuff, that they're missing big league material. So all of that is just part of the game as to how source methods analysis function in the real world, how it's a universal toolkit. It doesn't apply just in the sciences. It applies in absolutely everything. And now I think that about exhausts our field here. Any final comments from the gang before I shut down for the day?
No.
Nope. Nope. Okie doke.
Don't be a
Okay.
Tortugan. The internet's available for everybody to figure out what people are talking about.
Yeah.
That's a great one.
Yeah.
And make hashtag Tortugan alert trending.
Oh, and learn these two words: citation, please.
Yes, yes.
I have a
Or if
lot of
you're
friends who hate when I show
spoiled,
up
you
on
can
their
put in F in
discussion.
citation, please.
Yeah, I have a lot of friends who hate when I show up on their discussion. They say something just absolutely stupid. That's the first thing I ask. Citation, please.
The second thing you can ask them is, could you please change your Google search to the Google Scholar search so we can start looking at some actual articles instead of cosmopolitan articles?
Yeah.
Oh no, yeah, I tell people that all the time, and they do not take my advice. And then when I present them with an article I did get from Google Scholar, they shut down. So
Yeah.
Oh, Brian Stevens says more on GABA neurons. The two papers that I put up should be a fairly useful opening window, because if you look at them, there's going to be a ton of references in there that, when you follow up on a lot of that stuff, should open up still more. What I try to do, I don't always succeed completely, but what I try to do on a lot of these primary source papers that I put up are ones that will be sufficiently detailed in there that you can use them as windows that will open up more research on your own. And then, of course, you can do Google searching and all the other kinds of stuff that goes on. But every one of these, I have never stopped learning neat shit by following up on the content that are brought up clumsily by anti-evolutionists, because you find out so much fabulous science that's going on in there. I've never had a case where I found, well, boy, the creationists were ahead of the game on that one. Okay, well, we'll be shutting down for the night. There will be another show next week. There will certainly be more on good old contested bones. And thank you very much for following along, and help out in the projects in any way you can. Come into the TIP website and say hi, any of those things. Okay, bye, everybody. Shutting